On a Tuesday morning in March 1935, 6 uniformed officers of the NYPD's 28th Precinct were gathered in the cramped interrogation room on West 135th Street, trading jokes and cigarette smoke. Outside, Harlem was waking up to another Depression-era sunrise, bread lines forming, numbers runners taking their positions, and the streets of Lenox Avenue already buzzing with the rhythm of survival. Inside that room, the mood was light, almost cocky. They'd been told to expect someone who thought he could walk into a police station on his own terms. The desk sergeant had passed along the message an hour earlier. Bumpy Johnson says he's coming in to talk. Says he'll be here at 9. The laughter started immediately. Bumpy Johnson? Walking in here? Alone? Maybe he's tired of running. Maybe he's finally lost his mind. For the officers gathered that morning, the idea was absurd. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to everyone in Harlem as Bumpy, was one of the most dangerous men in New York City. Not because he was the loudest or the most violent, but because he was the most calculating. By 1935, Bumpy had already spent years working under Stephanie St. Clair, the woman they called the Queen of Numbers, helping her defend Harlem's illegal lottery rackets against white mob encroachment. He'd been arrested more than a dozen times. He'd been shot at, stabbed, betrayed, and every single time, he'd walked away stronger. The idea that he would voluntarily surrender himself to a room full of cops, without lawyers, without backup, without even a weapon, seemed like a bad joke. But at 9:03 a.m., the front door of the precinct swung open, and Bumpy Johnson walked in. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He moved with the kind of calm that only comes from a man who knows exactly what kind of power he holds and exactly how to use it. He was wearing a dark suit, perfectly pressed. His shoes were polished. His hat was tilted just slightly to the side. He didn't look like a man turning himself in. He looked like a man who had an appointment. The officers stopped laughing. One of them stood up, hand instinctively moving toward his belt. Another exchanged a glance with his partner. The desk sergeant, a man named Patrick O'Reilly, cleared his throat and gestured toward the interrogation room. "This way, Johnson." Bumpy nodded once. He didn't say a word. He just followed. The door closed behind him, and for the next 11 minutes, nobody spoke. What happened in that room would never be officially recorded. No transcript exists. No formal charges were filed that day. But by the time Bumpy Johnson walked back out on 135th Street, the power dynamic in Harlem had shifted in a way that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Because when a man walks into a police station without fear, it's not surrender. It's a message. And in 1935, in a Harlem caught between the Mafia, the police, and its own people, that message would echo louder than any gunshot ever could. This is the story of how one man used silence, reputation, and raw intimidation to turn a room full of armed officers into witnesses of their own irrelevance. This is the story of Bumpy Johnson, and the day he proved that real power doesn't need backup. To understand what happened in that interrogation room, you have to understand the Harlem that created Bumpy Johnson in the first place. By the mid-1930s, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a nation within a city. Between 1920 and 1930, the black population of Harlem had more than doubled, reaching over 200,000 residents. It was the cultural and economic heart of Black America, home to the Harlem Renaissance, jazz legends like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway, and an underground economy that generated millions of dollars every year. But it was also a battleground. The Depression had hit Harlem harder than almost anywhere else in America. Unemployment among black workers in New York City reached nearly 50% by 1932. Evictions were constant. Families were struggling. And in the absence of legitimate opportunity, Harlem's residents turned to the numbers game, an illegal lottery system where people could bet pennies on 3-digit combinations and dream of hitting it big. The numbers racket wasn't just gambling. It was survival. It was hope in the form of a folded slip of paper. And for years, it had been controlled by black Harlemites. Stephanie St. Clair, a woman who had arrived in Harlem from the Caribbean in the 1920s, had built one of the most successful numbers operations in the city. She was smart, ruthless, and fiercely protective of her community. She employed hundreds of runners, clerks, and enforcers. She paid off cops when she had to. She fought back when she didn't. And standing beside her, learning every lesson she had to teach, was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had arrived in Harlem in 1919 at the age of 14, after being sent north from South Carolina by his mother, who feared for his safety. He was skinny, quiet, and observant. But he was also angry. Angry at a world that treated black lives as disposable, angry at the injustice he saw every day, and angry enough to do something about it. By his early 20s, Bumpy had a reputation, not for being loud or flashy, but for being effective. If Madame St. Clair needed someone to collect debts, Bumpy collected them. If she needed someone to send a message, Bumpy delivered it. If she needed muscle, Bumpy provided it. Not through chaos, but through calculated intimidation. He didn't need to raise his voice, one former Harlem resident recalled years later. You just looked at him and you knew. But by 1935, everything was changing. The Italian Mafia, led by men like Charles Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz, had their eyes on Harlem. They saw the numbers racket generating millions, and they wanted it. They had money, political connections, and an army of enforcers. And they weren't asking permission. Dutch Schultz, in particular, was aggressive. He began pressuring black numbers operators to hand over their businesses or face violence. Some gave in. Others fought back and paid the price. Stephanie St. Clair refused to bend, and Bumpy Johnson stood with her. By March 1935, the tension in Harlem was suffocating. Shootings were becoming more frequent. Numbers runners were being beaten. Police were either on the Mafia's payroll or too intimidated to intervene. It was into this volatile, dangerous world that Bumpy Johnson made his decision. He was going to walk into the 28th Precinct, alone, unarmed, because Bumpy understood something that most people didn't. Fear isn't about who has the biggest gun. Fear is about who's willing to look power in the eye and refuse to blink. Let's return to that interrogation room. When Bumpy Johnson walked in, he didn't just face faceless authority. He faced men, real men, with names, reputations, and egos. Sergeant Patrick O'Reilly, the senior officer present, was a 15-year veteran of the NYPD. Irish Catholic, loyal to the department, and deeply embedded in the politics of Harlem policing. He wasn't corrupt in the traditional sense. He didn't take bribes from every corner hustler, but he was practical. He knew who ran things in Harlem, and he knew when to look the other way. Detective Raymond Foley sat to O'Reilly's right. Younger, more ambitious, and less patient. Foley had made his name busting small-time drug dealers and petty thieves, and he was hungry to move up. A big collar, someone like Bumpy Johnson, could be his ticket. Officer James Jimmy Caruso leaned against the wall near the door. He was muscle, former boxer, not particularly bright, but loyal and intimidating. He was there in case things got physical. And then there was Lieutenant William Archer, standing near the back of the room. Archer was different. He was older, quieter, and more observant. He'd been in Harlem long enough to understand its rhythms. He knew that arresting Bumpy Johnson wouldn't solve anything. It would just create a vacuum that someone more violent would fill. These were the men who thought they held the power that morning. They were wrong. Bumpy sat down slowly, never breaking eye contact with O'Reilly. He placed his hands flat on the table. No cuffs, no restraints. No one had even asked. O'Reilly spoke first. You said you wanted to talk. Bumpy nodded. So talk. Bumpy leaned back slightly. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost conversational. I came to tell you something. O'Reilly waited. The Italians are making moves in Harlem. You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it. Foley leaned forward. What's your point, Johnson? Bumpy's eyes shifted to him, just for a moment, then back to O'Reilly. My point is this. When the Italians take over the numbers, they won't just run the game. They'll run you. The room went quiet. They'll own the precinct, Bumpy continued. They'll decide who works, who gets promoted, who gets a cut. Right now, you've got a choice. You can work with the people who live here, people who respect boundaries. Or you can let the Mafia turn Harlem into their personal cash machine. O'Reilly's jaw tightened. You threatening us, Johnson? Bumpy smiled. Just barely. No, Sergeant. I'm offering you information. What you do with it is up to you. For a moment, no one moved. Then Archer, the older lieutenant, spoke from the back. And what do you want in return? Bumpy looked at him. This was the question he'd been waiting for. I want you to remember who your real problem is. It's not me. It's not Madame St. Clair. It's the men who think they can walk into Harlem and take whatever they want. He stood up. No one stopped him. Have a good day, gentlemen. And just like that, Bumpy Johnson walked out. The officers sat in stunned silence. Because in that moment, they realized something unsettling. Bumpy Johnson hadn't come to surrender. He'd come to negotiate, and he'd done it on his terms. What Bumpy Johnson did that day, in March 1935, wasn't reckless. It was strategic. And to understand the full impact, you need to understand the invisible war being fought in Harlem streets. Dutch Schultz had been escalating his takeover attempt for months. Born Arthur Flegenheimer in the Bronx, Schultz was one of the most brutal mobsters in New York. By 1935, he controlled bootlegging operations, speakeasies, and protection rackets across the city. But the numbers game in Harlem represented something bigger. A daily cash flow that could generate $20 million a year, roughly $450 million in today's dollars. Schultz's method was simple: violence and intimidation. His enforcers would visit Numbers bankers and give them a choice: sell your operation to Dutch, or watch it burn. Some sold. Others resisted and disappeared. Stephanie St. Clair was one of the few who refused, and Bumpy Johnson was her enforcer. But here's what made Bumpy different from every other muscle in Harlem. He understood that raw violence was a short-term solution. It attracted attention. It brought law enforcement down hard. And it made enemies faster than it made money. Bumpy's approach was psychological. He didn't need to shoot someone in broad daylight to send message. He needed to make people understand that crossing him came with consequences, quiet, inevitable consequences. One story, corroborated by multiple Harlem residents over the years, involved a Schultz enforcer named Tommy Gallo. Gallo had been pressuring a numbers runner named Willie Green to switch his loyalty from Madame St. Clair to Schultz. Gallo made threats. He roughed up Willie's cousin. He made it clear that compliance wasn't optional. 3 days later, Gallo was found his car outside a Bronx diner. He wasn't dead. He wasn't even injured. But his wallet, his gun, and his shoes were gone. And pinned to the steering wheel was a simple note: next time. No signature. No explanation needed. Gallo left Harlem and never came back. This was Bumpy's genius. He understood fear better than anyone. He knew that uncertainty was more powerful than violence. If you kill a man, his friends know exactly what happened and why. If you humiliate him, leave him alive, and make him wonder what comes next, that fear spreads. By the spring of 1935, Bumpy Johnson's reputation had grown to mythic proportions. Schultz's men were starting to hesitate before entering certain Harlem blocks. Cops were starting to realize that arresting Bumpy might create more problems than it solved. And that's why Bumpy walked into the 28th precinct that March morning. He wasn't turning himself in. He was reminding everyone, cops, mobsters, and civilians alike, that he wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. And he wasn't afraid. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more deep dives into the untold legends of crime history, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more where this came from. But back to 1935, because what happened next would change everything. In October 1935, 7 months after Bumpy's visit to the 28th precinct, Dutch Schultz was murdered. He was gunned down in a Newark, New Jersey restaurant by assassins working for the newly formed Mafia Commission, the same organization led by Lucky Luciano. The official reason was that Schultz had become too reckless, too violent, and too much of a liability. He wanted to kill a federal prosecutor, and the commission feared it would bring down too much heat. But in Harlem, people whispered a different story. They said that Bumpy Johnson had gotten word to Luciano, that he'd made it clear, if Schultz kept pushing in Harlem, the violence would spiral out of control. Blood in the streets meant cops flooding the neighborhood. Cops flooding the neighborhood meant everyone's business suffered, black and Italian alike. There's no hard evidence that Bumpy directly influenced Schultz's death. But here's what is documented. After Schultz died, Luciano made a deal with Harlem's numbers operators. He would take a cut of the profits, but he wouldn't take over the operations. The black bankers would keep running their own games. Stephanie St. Clair famously sent Luciano a telegram after Schultz's death. It reportedly read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." And Bumpy Johnson? He became Luciano's Harlem connection. Think about that for a moment. A black enforcer from the South, operating in a segregated city, had not only survived a war with the Italian Mafia, he'd ended up as their partner. But this partnership came with costs. Over the next decade, Bumpy would serve multiple prison sentences. He'd be arrested more than 40 times. He'd watch as Harlem's underground economy slowly shifted from black control to Mafia influence. And he'd come to understand that even his legendary reputation couldn't protect him from the grinding machinery of the criminal justice system. By the 1940s, Bumpy was spending more time in prison than on the streets. Sing Sing, Alcatraz, Leavenworth. He did time in some of America's toughest prisons. But even behind bars, his legend grew. Inmates respected him. Guards learned not to provoke him. And when he was finally released in the 1960s, Harlem welcomed him back like a returning king. But that's a story for another time. Let's return to the question that's been hanging over this entire story. What actually happened during those 11 minutes in the interrogation room? We know Bumpy walked in. We know he walked out. We know no charges were filed. But what was said? According to accounts pieced together from retired officers and Harlem residents who heard the story secondhand, Bumpy didn't threaten anyone directly. He didn't confess to crimes. He didn't make demands. What he did was far more effective. He made the officers complicit. He told them, in clear terms, that Dutch Schultz was coming for Harlem, that Schultz's men were violent, unpredictable, and didn't respect the informal agreements that kept the neighborhood stable, that if the NYPD allowed the Mafia to take over completely, the violence would spiral beyond anyone's control. And then, and this was the masterstroke, he offered to be a source. Not an informant, not a snitch, a source. He would keep them informed of major moves in the underworld. He would help them avoid the worst violence. In exchange, they would stop treating him like public enemy number one and start recognizing him as someone who maintained order. It was a calculated gamble, and it worked. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. By 1935, the NYPD in Harlem wasn't really interested in stopping crime. They were interested in managing it. They wanted the numbers game to operate quietly. They wanted gang violence contained. They wanted the money to flow into the neighborhood, into their own pockets through bribes, into the political machine that kept everyone employed. Bumpy understood this better than anyone. He understood that cops didn't want chaos. They wanted control. And by walking into that precinct and framing himself as a stabilizing force rather than a criminal threat, he changed the equation. Lieutenant Archer, the older officer who'd asked what Bumpy wanted, reportedly left the precinct that day and told a colleague, "That man is more dangerous than 10 Dutch Schultzes." "Why?" the colleague asked. "Because Schultz thinks with his fists. Johnson thinks 3 moves ahead." Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968. He collapsed in a Harlem restaurant, victim of a heart attack. He was 62 years old. By the time of his death, Harlem had changed. The numbers game had been largely absorbed by the Mafia. The neighborhood was struggling with heroin, poverty, and urban decay. The same streets that had once been the cultural heart of Black America were now synonymous with crime and neglect. But Bumpy's legacy remained. To this day, residents of Harlem speak his name with a mixture of respect and reverence. He's been the subject of books, films, and documentaries. Denzel Washington portrayed him in American Gangster. Forrest Whitaker brought him to life in the television series Godfather of Harlem. But the real Bumpy Johnson was more complex than any Hollywood portrayal could capture. He was a criminal. There's no denying that. He hurt people. He broke laws. He participated in a system that exploited desperate people's hopes. But he was also a protector. He fought to keep Harlem's economy in Harlem's hands. He stood up to powerful men who saw black neighborhoods as territories to be conquered. And he did it with intelligence, strategy, and an almost supernatural understanding of power dynamics. The day Bumpy Johnson walked into the 28th Precinct without backup wasn't about bravado. It was about sending a message that echoed far beyond that interrogation room. It said, "I'm not afraid of you." It said, "I know how this game is played." And most importantly, it said, "I will not be erased." In a world that tried to make black lives invisible, Bumpy Johnson made himself impossible to ignore. The officers who laughed that morning learned a lesson that day. They learned that power isn't always about who has the gun or the badge. Sometimes, power is about who has the courage to walk into a room where they're outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, and still control the conversation. That was Bumpy Johnson. And that's why, more than 50 years after his death, we're still telling his story. Because legends aren't built on what people do when they have backup. Legends are built on what they do when they walk in alone and walk out on their own terms.